No one noticed the storm coming, not until the ground itself began to move. In a quiet desert town where spring was supposed to bring peace, one man stood alone between rising water and a future that could erase everything he had tried to protect. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. But when the land answered back, it chose him. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Santa Fe rested beneath the wide spring sky like a town slowly waking from a long, stubborn winter. The adobe buildings, low, sun-baked, and the color of softened clay, caught the gentler light of the season, their edges warmed rather than scorched. The air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of damp earth, new grass struggling through dust, and faint wood smoke from morning fires not yet forgotten. A steady breeze moved through the streets, not harsh, not cruel, lifting pale red grit in lazy spirals that no longer burned the lungs but still reminded everyone where they lived. Spring in the high desert did not promise comfort. It offered balance, a fragile truce between endurance and relief. It was from the southern road where winter ruts were beginning to soften and stones no longer bit so sharply into hooves that Silas Crow entered the town. He rode alone on a gray horse whose age showed in the careful way it chose each step, though spring had brought a touch of strength. Back to its stride, the animal's coat held a muted sheen, brushed clean but worn thin by years of honest miles. Silas matched the horse's rhythm, seated easily, reins held with quiet precision. He was tall and lean, broad through the shoulders, his build shaped by labor rather than excess. His face was angular, cheekbones defined beneath skin darkened by sun rather than hardship. A short, rough beard shadowed his jaw, dark and uneven, and a thin scar traced along his chin. Old, settled, no longer tender. Strands of nearly black hair slipped loose beneath a weathered hat whose brim had been bent and reshaped by years of wind rather than care. He appeared to be in his early 30s, though the calm in his movements suggested a man who had lived longer than numbers implied. His hazel eyes, green when the spring light struck them directly, brown in shade, were watchful without being wary. He wore a patched leather jacket light enough for the season, canvas trousers rubbed pale at his chest, the knees and boots marked by dust rather than neglect. Nothing about him demanded attention, yet nothing about him invited dismissal. He looked like a man accustomed to being underestimated and comfortable with it. The first to acknowledge his arrival was a dog. Juniper was an aging cattle dog, medium-sized, with a mottled brown and white coat and a torn left ear that folded slightly wrong. His muzzle had gone half white, and one hind leg carried a permanent stiffness that showed when he moved too quickly. No one claimed him, yet most people fed him when they remembered. Juniper approached Silas's horse without hesitation, sniffed once, then sat squarely in front of it, tail still, eyes alert. His amber gaze never left Silas's face. Silas dismounted carefully, resting a steady hand against the horse's neck before looking down at the dog. For a brief moment, his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, more like recognition. He nodded once, as if accepting a silent judgment. Across the street, Elena Moore watched from the shade beside the blacksmith shop, where the forge door stood open to let in the mild spring air. Elena was 25, compact and strong, her body shaped by necessity rather than intention. Her posture was straight without being rigid, her movements efficient, learned through years of carrying water, lifting supplies, and repairing what could not be replaced. Her chestnut brown hair, threaded with copper, was braided tightly and pinned up, though spring wind loosened soft strands around her temples. Her skin was fair by desert standards, freckled across her nose and cheeks, touched by sun but not yet hardened by summer. A thin scar crossed her right wrist, pale and clean, an old reminder of carelessness she never repeated. She wore a practical cotton dress in a muted green, sleeves rolled to her forearms, her hands clean but marked by faint burns and calluses. Her eyes were gray-blue, steady and observant, the kind that noticed patterns before people. Elena had learned young that attention was not curiosity, it was survival. Inside the forge, Tomas Rourke worked the bellows with steady strength. Tom was nearing 60, thick through the waist and arms, his body shaped by decades of ironwork. His hair had turned iron gray, his beard heavy and often flecked with soot. Once quick-tempered, grief had long ago worn that edge down, leaving him with a gruff patience and a sense of fairness. He rarely spoke aloud. He followed Elena's gaze and grunted softly. "That one's not just passing through," he said. "You can tell by how he rides." Elena said nothing. Her attention had shifted toward the saloon near the plaza. The painted coyote stood crooked and familiar, its faded sign bearing a poorly painted animal grinning like it knew every secret worth selling. Wade Haskins leaned against its front post, flanked by two men who copied his stance. Wade was 28, tall, broad-shouldered, sun-reddened, his rust-colored hair catching the light. His expression hovered between amusement and contempt. A dent split his left eyebrow, the mark of a bar fight that had earned him reputation instead of restraint. Since then, Wade mistook noise for authority and intimidation for strength. He spotted Silas immediately. "Spring must be generous this year," Wade called, voice carrying easily in the mild air. "Even the poor cowboys are blooming." A few men laughed, more from habit than humor. Silas stopped his horse. He did not tense or turn away. He looked at Wade calmly, as if considering whether the man was worth responding to. "Just looking for work," Silas said, voice even, unforced. Wade stepped forward, resting his hands near his belt. "Work costs," he replied, eyes skimming Silas's clothes. "You got anything worth paying with?" Silas glanced briefly at Juniper, then back at Wade. "I've got hands," he said, "and I've got time." The words settled into the space between them without challenge or apology. Before the moment could sharpen, Sheriff Abram Pike crossed the street. Pike was in his mid-40s, tall and narrow, his face lined but alert, his mustache neatly trimmed. He moved at an unhurried pace, a man who understood that spring or not, trouble grew fast if ignored. "That's enough," he said evenly. He turned to Silas. "Name?" "Silas Crow." Pike studied him for a moment. "Looking to stay?" "If there's work," Silas replied. Pike nodded. "Santa Fe respects honest labor," he said, then glanced at Wade. "It doesn't reward barking." Wade stepped back with a shrug, though his eyes lingered. Silas led his horse toward the hitching rail near the forge. Elena noticed the way he rubbed the animal's neck, slow and deliberate, before loosening the saddle. Without quite deciding to, she stepped forward. "There's water behind the shop," she said. "Stays cool." Silas looked at really looked, and for a brief moment, Elena felt seen in a way that was neither intrusive nor dismissive. His eyes softened slightly. "Thank you," he said. Juniper followed as Silas led the horse away, as if the decision had already been made. Tom Rourke shook his head faintly. "That dog's choosy," he muttered. "Means something." Elena watched Silas disappear behind the forge as spring wind moved gently through the street, carrying dust without cruelty. The plaza resumed its rhythm, lighter now, voices lifted by the season. Elena told herself it meant nothing. Strangers came, some stayed, most didn't matter. Yet as Silas Crow worked the forge by late afternoon light, quiet, capable, uncomplaining, Elena felt a subtle shift, like the first warm day after a long winter. Not a promise, not yet, just the sense that something had begun. And above Santa Fe, the spring sky stretched wide and patient, as if giving the town one more chance to change before. Summer demanded its price. Spring settled more firmly over Santa Fe in the days that followed, not with drama, but with consistency. Mornings came cool and pale, the air carrying the scent of damp soil where snowmelt had briefly softened the ground before retreating again. By afternoon, sunlight warmed the adobe walls without scorching them, and the wind, though ever present, had lost its winter bite. It was a season that encouraged movement, repairs long delayed, debts finally addressed, decisions no longer postponed. For some, spring felt like permission. For others, it felt like pressure. Silas Crow worked at the forge as though he had always belonged there. He rose before dawn, when the sky was still the color of old steel, and tended to his horse with a quiet attentiveness that bordered on ritual. The gray gelding, Silas called him Ash, was well into his years, perhaps 16 or 17, with clouding eyes and a temperament shaped by patience rather than spirit. Ash no longer startled at sudden sounds, nor did he pull against the bit. He waited, listened, and trusted. Silas brushed him carefully each morning, checking hooves, running his hands along the animal's legs with the practiced awareness of someone who understood how small injuries became large ones if ignored. When Silas spoke to Ash, it was rarely more than a murmur, but the horse responded as if every word mattered. Juniper followed them everywhere. The old cattle dog had decided, without ceremony, that Silas was now part of his daily circuit. He slept near the forge door, nose tucked beneath his tail, and lifted his head whenever Silas moved. Despite his age, Juniper remained alert, his amber eyes missing little. He had learned caution through hardship, too many winters spent scavenging, too many careless hands. But with Silas, his wariness softened into watchfulness. Tom Rourke noticed it by the second day. "Dog don't give loyalty easy," Tom said, handing Silas a hammer. "Means you're either worth following, or he's finally lost his sense." Silas said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. The forge itself became a place of measured rhythm. Silas worked steadily, without flourish, his movements precise and economical. He did not rush tasks to impress, nor did he linger unnecessarily. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions only when needed, and accepted instruction without pride. Tom watched him closely at first, testing him with difficult repairs and stubborn iron. By the third day, Tom had stopped hovering. By the fifth, he trusted Silas to work unsupervised. Elena noticed all of it. She passed the forge daily, sometimes with purpose, sometimes without, carrying supplies, returning borrowed tools, or simply checking whether Tom needed water. At first, she told herself her attention was practical. The forge was central to town life. It mattered who worked there. But as the days passed, she became aware of smaller details. The way Silas wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of soot across his skin. The way he stepped aside instinctively to give others room. The way his presence quieted certain men while irritating others. They spoke little, Silas and Elena. When they did, it was about ordinary things, the quality of iron, the way spring storms came quickly and left just as fast, the stubbornness of old tools. Yet beneath those conversations ran a current of shared understanding. Both of them knew what it meant to carry responsibility without applause. Elena's responsibilities weighed heavier as spring advanced. Her mother, Margaret Moore, had once been a capable woman with sharp eyes and steadier hands, but illness had thinned her into something fragile and unpredictable. Margaret was in her early 50s, her dark hair streaked prematurely with gray, her frame narrow beneath layers of carefully mended shawls. She spent most mornings by the window, watching the street as if waiting for something she could not name. Some days she spoke clearly, recalling details with painful precision. Other days she drifted, confused by time, frightened by shadows. The doctor's visits had become less frequent, not because Margaret had improved, but because the cost had become impossible. Elena managed the household alone. She kept the small adobe home clean, stretched food carefully, and tracked debts with a precision that left little room for hope. The largest of those debts belonged to Samuel Hargreave, a man who owned more land than he needed and fewer mercies than he pretended. Hargreave was in his early 40s. Tall and narrow, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that rarely softened. He dressed well, favored polite language, and conducted cruelty with a businessman's patience. Years earlier, he had lent money to Elena's father for repairs that never paid off. When her father died, the debt passed to her like an inheritance no one warned her about. Hargreave had begun to visit more often. He arrived one afternoon riding a chestnut horse bred for display rather than work, his boots polished, his hat new. He dismounted with practiced ease, surveying the Moore house as if already measuring its worth. "Miss Moore," he said, his voice smooth, almost kind. "Spring suits this place, makes one hopeful." Elena stood firm, hands folded at her waist. "Hope doesn't settle accounts," she replied. Hargreave smiled thinly. "No, but arrangements can." Word of his visits traveled quickly. Santa Fe was not a large town, and pressure rarely stayed private for long. Tom noticed Elena's distraction. Juniper growled softly one evening when Hargreave passed the forge. Silas, hammer in hand, looked up once, his expression unreadable. That night, after the forge closed, Silas stayed behind to finish a repair. The spring evening cooled quickly, shadows lengthening across the street. Elena passed by on her way home, her steps slower than usual. Silas wiped his hands and hesitated, then spoke. "You look like you're carrying more than tools," he said quietly. Elena stopped. For a moment she considered brushing him off. Habit urged her towards silence. Instead, something in his tone, plain without expectation, made her pause. "Some debts don't care about seasons," she said. It was not a confession, but it was not a lie either. Silas nodded once. "If you ever need an extra set of hands," he said, "I've got time." The words echoed his first answer to Wade, but now they meant something different. Later that night, Silas sat outside the small room he rented behind the forge, cleaning his tools beneath the stars. Spring had thinned the darkness, constellations stood out sharply, unblurred by winter haze. He thought of the way Elena had held herself when Hargreaves spoke to her, straight-backed, controlled, but braced. He recognized that posture. He had worn it himself. Once, when pressure arrived disguised as opportunity. He didn't sleep easily. The next morning brought change. Sheriff Pike arrived at the forge earlier than usual, his expression thoughtful. "Hargreaves been asking questions," he said to Tom and Silas alike. "About land. About arrangements." He looked directly at Silas. "You planning on staying long, Crow?" Silas met his gaze. "Long enough," he said. Pike studied him, then nodded. "That's usually how it starts." By midday, the forge buzzed with rumor. Some said Hargreave intended to make a formal offer to Elena. Others claimed he planned to seize the Moore house outright. Opinions split quickly. Practical men shrugged. Kinder ones worried quietly. Wade Haskins, for his part, laughed openly. "That's how things go," he said. "Debt finds its end." Silas said nothing. He worked. As the sun dipped lower, Elena returned to the forge with a small bundle of cloth. Fresh bread, still warm. She handed it to Tom, then hesitated before offering a piece to Silas. Their fingers brushed briefly. It was nothing. It felt like something. Juniper thumped his tail against the ground. Spring wind moved gently through Santa Fe, carrying with it the promise of growth and the threat of reckoning. Silas Crow stood at the edge of decisions he had not planned to revisit. Elena Moore walked a narrowing path between dignity and survival. Neither of them yet understood how closely those paths were about to cross. Spring did not soften Santa Fe's business. It only made its intentions clearer. By the second week of warmer days, doors stayed open longer, conversations lingered in the streets, and decisions that had been postponed through winter were brought into the light. The town moved with quiet purpose, like a ledger finally balanced after months of uncertainty. For Elena Moore, that purpose arrived in the form of a knock at her door just after mid-morning. Samuel Hargreave did not raise his hand twice. He stood on the Moore doorstep with the composure of a man who expected to be welcomed, or at least endured. Up close, Hargreave was narrower than he appeared from a distance, his frame tall but spare, as if his body conserved itself the way his mind did. His beard was trimmed close and flecked faintly with gray, shaped carefully to frame a mouth that rarely smiled without calculation. His hair, dark and thinning at the temples, was combed back neatly beneath a hat that had never known dust. His eyes, pale brown and watchful, moved constantly, measuring angles, conditions, weaknesses. He spoke politely, but his politeness carried weight. It was the kind that assumed agreement would follow. "Elena," he said, removing his hat as though manners were currency. "May I come in?" Elena stepped aside. Refusal would have changed nothing except the tone. Inside, the small adobe house was neat but spare. Light filtered through thin curtains, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the spring air. Margaret Moore sat near the window, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the mildness of the day. Her face brightened briefly at the sight of company, then clouded with confusion. "Your father's home early," she murmured, voice thin and uncertain. Elena moved quickly. "Mother, this is Mr. Hargreave," she said gently. "He's here on business." Margaret nodded, though it was unclear whether she understood. She returned her gaze to the street as if the matter had resolved itself. Hargreave took the chair Elena offered, crossing his legs with practiced ease. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "Spring is an efficient season. It favors clarity." Elena remained standing. "Then be clear." Hargreave folded his hands. Your debt has reached its limit, he said calmly. I have been patient, more patient than most would be. He paused, allowing the silence to do its work. I'm prepared to offer a solution. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Which is? A formal arrangement, Hargreave replied. Marriage, practical, legal, and final. In exchange, your debt is settled, your mother is provided for, the house remains in your care. The words landed exactly as intended, measured, unavoidable. Elena didn't sit. And if I refuse? Hargreave's gaze flicked briefly toward Margaret, then back to Elena. Then I proceed with foreclosure, he said evenly, within the month. When he left, the house felt smaller. Margaret slept through the afternoon, exhausted by confusion. Elena sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. She had known this moment would come. Knowing did not make it lighter. By evening, the news had reached the forge. Tom Rourke swore quietly when he heard it. That man's been circling like a hawk, he muttered. Never misses his timing. Juniper growled low in his throat, ears back. Silas listened without interruption. His expression did not change, but something in his posture tightened, subtle as a drawn rein. When? He asked. Elena's got a week, Tom said. Maybe less. Silas nodded once and returned to his work, but the hammer struck iron harder than before. That night, Silas did not remain behind the forge. He walked the long way back to his room, passing the Moore house as lamplight glowed faintly through the windows. He stopped at the gate, hesitated, then turned away. He had learned long ago that stepping in too early often made things worse. The following morning brought rain, light, unexpected, and brief. Spring storms moved fast across the desert, leaving the air cleaner and the ground darkened but not softened. Silas worked through it, his jacket darkened at the shoulders, his focus unwavering. By midday, Sheriff Pike approached the forge, his expression more guarded than usual. Hargreaves filed paperwork, Pike said quietly. Legal, as far as it goes. Silas wiped his hands. And if someone contests it? Pike studied him. That'd take standing. And money. Silas nodded. I understand. Late that afternoon, Elena arrived at the forge with a parcel wrapped in cloth, mended gloves Tom had left at her house months earlier. She handed them over, exchanged brief words with Tom, then turned to leave. Silas spoke before she could. Elena. She paused. He walked toward her slowly, careful not to crowd her space. If you'd like to talk, he said, I'll listen. Elena looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time since Hargreaves' visit, her composure faltered. There isn't much to say, she replied. Some problems solve themselves, others decide for you. Silas held her gaze. I don't believe that. They walked together, not toward the Moore house, but past it, down a dirt path that led beyond the last row of buildings. Juniper followed at a distance. The air smelled of wet earth and new grass. Elena spoke without drama, laying out the facts as if reciting an inventory. Silas listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, silence settled between them. I won't ask you to fix this, Elena said finally. It isn't your burden. Silas stopped. You didn't ask, he replied. But burdens don't wait for invitations. He told her then, carefully, without embellishment, about land he managed outside town. Not wealth, not power, just property legally held, unused. I've been keeping it quiet, he said, for reasons. He did not explain further. If there were a way to settle your debt without binding you to someone who doesn't see you, I'd consider it. Elena turned to face him fully. Why? Silas's answer was immediate. Because I know what it costs to trade yourself for security. She studied him, searching for pride, pity, or expectation. She found none. You barely know me. He nodded. That's true. They returned to town without resolving anything. The following day, Hargreave returned, this time to the forge. He dismounted with smooth confidence, surveying the worksite with polite disinterest. Mr. Crow, he said, reading the name as if from a ledger. You're new here. Silas met his gaze calmly. That's right. I understand you've taken an interest in Miss Moore's affairs, Hargreave continued. Silas did not deny it. I'm interested in fairness. Hargreave smiled faintly. Fairness is a flexible concept. Not to everyone, Silas replied. The two men stood facing each other, similar in height, opposite in every other way. Hargreaves' posture was relaxed, practiced. Silas's was still, coiled. After a moment, Hargreave inclined his head. I trust you won't interfere, he said. This matter will conclude shortly. When he left, Tom exhaled heavily. That man doesn't like obstacles. Silas watched Hargreave ride away, then turned back to his work. But that night, he didn't sleep. On the third evening, Elena came to him. She found Silas behind the forge, tools laid out neatly, Juniper resting nearby. The sky was clear, stars sharp against the dark. I've thought about what you said, she began. Silas waited. If there is another way, Elena continued, I need it to be honest, no bargains that leave new debts behind. Silas nodded. Then we speak plainly. They stood there, not yet deciding, but no longer pretending the decision was not theirs. Spring wind moved through Santa Fe, carrying with it the quiet knowledge that some arrangements were about to be rewritten. Spring reached its full voice the week Santa Fe began to whisper about Elena Moore's future as if it were already decided. Doors closed more softly when she passed. Conversations paused, then resumed with lowered tones. In a town that prided itself on practicality, sympathy often arrived disguised as certainty. People believed they understood how things would end, and that belief made them careless. Silas Crow did not share it. The night Elena came to him behind the forge, leaving their conversation unfinished, Silas remained awake long after the stars had crossed the highest point of the sky. He sat on the wooden steps of his rented room, Juniper curled nearby, the old dog's chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. Ash stood tethered a short distance away, head lowered, ears flicking occasionally at distant sounds. Silas watched the town lights dim one by one, his thoughts moving with deliberate weight. He had avoided entanglement for years, not because he feared commitment, but because he understood its cost. He had learned early that stepping forward meant stepping into visibility, and visibility invited demands. The land he held outside Santa Fe, quiet, undeveloped, legally sound, was meant to remain that way. It was not a hiding place, but it was not an invitation either. Using it would mean answering questions he had carefully postponed. By morning, Silas had decided. The day broke cool and clear. A light breeze carried the smell of damp earth and mesquite blossoms from beyond the town's edge. Silas rose before the forge opened, saddled Ash, and rode out while the streets were still empty. Juniper followed, keeping pace with the steady patience of a dog who no longer wasted energy on uncertainty. The land lay several miles west, beyond a shallow ridge where scrubgrass gave way to open ground. It was not impressive at first glance. The soil was firm, the slope gentle, the boundaries marked cleanly by old survey stakes. What mattered lay beneath: water access, mineral rights long verified, and a location close enough to Santa Fe to hold value without drawing attention. Silas dismounted and walked the perimeter, his boots leaving shallow prints in the spring-softened earth. This land had been purchased years ago, deliberately and quietly, after an event he did not often revisit. The sale of his first holding, rushed and ill-considered, that had cost others their livelihoods and taught him caution at a steep price. He returned to town by mid-morning, with resolve settled like a stone in his chest. Elena did not expect to see him at her door that afternoon. Silas knocked once, firm but not insistent. When Elena opened the door, she found him clean-shaven, hat in hand, his jacket brushed free of forge dust. He looked less like a laborer and more like a man conducting business, though nothing about his posture suggested superiority. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. Inside, Margaret slept, in her chair, breathing shallow but steady. Silas lowered his voice. "I won't stay long." Elena folded her arms loosely, bracing herself. "You said you wanted honesty." "I still do," Silas replied. "That's why I'm here." He laid it out plainly. No grand gestures, no promises of rescue. He explained the land, its legal standing, and his intention to use it as collateral to settle her debt outright, without transfer of ownership, without obligation beyond repayment on fair terms. "It won't bind you to me," he said, "and it won't leave you beholden to Hargreave." Elena listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. "And what does it bind you to?" she asked. Silas met her gaze. "Visibility," he said. "Questions. Attention I've avoided." "That's not nothing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Elena turned away briefly, glancing toward her mother. When she spoke again, her voice was steady. "I won't accept charity." "This isn't charity," Silas replied. "It's leverage." She considered that. "And if it fails?" "Then I'll have tried," he said simply. "And you'll still have your choice." They agreed to meet the following morning with Sheriff Pike present to ensure transparency. No secrecy. No misdirection. News traveled faster than expected. By evening, Samuel Hargreave knew. He arrived at the forge before dawn the next day, riding hard, his usual composure frayed at the edges. His beard, so carefully maintained, showed signs of haste, and his eyes held irritation sharpened into focus. He dismounted and approached Silas directly, ignoring Tom's presence entirely. "You are overstepping," Hargreave said quietly. Silas did not look up from his work. "I'm participating," he replied. Hargreave's jaw tightened. "You don't understand the implications." Silas finally turned. "I understand. Contracts," he said, "and consent." The meeting at the sheriff's office drew a small audience. Sheriff Pike presided with measured calm. He had invited Elias Monroe, the town's notary and legal clerk, a thin man in his early 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. Monroe spoke little, but his presence carried authority. He examined Silas's documents carefully, nodding as he read. Hargreave argued efficiently. He questioned Silas's standing, the legitimacy of the land's valuation, and the timing of the proposal. Elena sat quietly, hands folded, watching each man in turn. When Pike asked if she wished to speak, she did. "I am not transferring my life to settle a debt," Elena said. "I am settling a debt to protect my life." The room stilled. Monroe cleared his throat. "The terms are sound," he said, "provided all parties consent." Hargreave's gaze cut toward Elena. "You would align yourself with a stranger over certainty?" asked. Elena met his eyes. "I would choose a future that does not require my silence." Hargreave said nothing more. He gathered his papers, his movements precise but tight. "This is not finished," he said and left. The contract was signed by midday. By afternoon, Santa Fe buzzed with speculation. Some praised Silas's audacity. Others questioned his motives. Wade Haskins laughed loudly in the saloon, calling it a foolish gamble. Juniper followed Silas closely, ears alert. Ash stood calm at the hitching rail, unbothered by the attention. Elena returned home lighter than she had felt in months, though the weight had not vanished entirely. Freedom, she knew, required maintenance. That evening, Silas walked her to her door. They didn't speak of the future beyond what had already been agreed. At the threshold, Elena paused. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Silas nodded. "I know." She studied him. "Why did you?" He answered honestly. "Because when I saw what was being asked of you, I recognized the shape of it." Elena opened the door, then stopped. "This doesn't make us anything," she said. "No," Silas replied. "It doesn't." But as he walked away under the spring sky, Juniper trotting beside him, both of them knew the town would not see it that way. Some contracts, once written, changed more than numbers. The contract did not change Santa Fe overnight, but it altered the way the town looked at Silas Crow and Elena Moore, which in a place like this mattered almost as much as law. By the third morning after the signing, the forge felt smaller, not because the walls had moved, but because eyes lingered longer. Men paused mid-sentence when Silas entered. Women measured Elena with a new curiosity, some approving, others sharpened by suspicion. Spring light still softened the streets, but the air carried a different tension, as if the town were testing the weight of a new truth. Silas felt it first at work. Tom Rourke treated him no differently, which was its own kind of loyalty. Tom's thick arms still moved the bellows with the same rhythm, his voice still gruff, his instructions unchanged. But customers hesitated. A few men who once greeted Silas with nods now watched him with narrowed eyes, calculating. Others were bolder, clapping him on the shoulder and calling him clever, as if Cleverness were the same thing as character. Silas accepted neither judgment. He worked. Ash remained steady through it all. The gray gelding seemed to sense the shift but refused to be troubled by it, chewing hay calmly, ears flicking at flies and distant sounds. Juniper, however, grew more vigilant. The old dog positioned himself closer to Silas, sleeping lighter, his amber eyes tracking movement with renewed focus. Age had not dulled his instincts, it had refined them. Elena felt the change in quieter ways. Neighbors who once passed with polite indifference now stopped to ask after her mother's health, after the house, after her plans. Their concern carried an edge, questions layered with expectation. Margaret Moore, for her part, seemed calmer that week. The pressure that had tightened the house for months had eased, and though confusion still came and went, Margaret slept more soundly, her breathing deeper, her nights less restless. One afternoon, Elena received a visitor she had not expected. Clara Bennett arrived just past noon, her steps light but purposeful. Clara was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with dark blonde hair pulled into a neat knot at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple but well-kept dress and carried herself with quiet confidence. Her eyes were warm brown, observant without being intrusive. Clara taught at the small schoolhouse on the north side of town, a woman known for fairness and patience. She had grown up poor herself, the daughter of a surveyor killed in a land dispute years earlier, a loss that had shaped her belief in measured justice over loud conviction. "I wanted to see how you were holding up," Clara said as Elena ushered her inside. "People talk. I thought you might appreciate someone who doesn't." Elena smiled faintly. "I do." They shared tea at the small table, speaking of ordinary things at first. Then Clara leaned back slightly, studying Elena. "What you did took courage," she said. "Not everyone here understands that." Elena met her gaze. "I didn't do it for understanding." "No," Clara agreed. "You did it for survival." That evening, as Elena walked toward the forge with a basket of mended cloth, she saw Samuel Hargreave again. He stood across the street, speaking with a man Elena did not recognize. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his authority openly. His coat was well-tailored, his boots new, and his beard, dark and full, was trimmed in a way that suggested recent attention. His hair was black, combed neatly back, and his posture radiated confidence earned not through hardship, but through position. This was Everett Langley, though Elena did not know his name yet, a land assessor from Albuquerque, known for his efficiency and his willingness to favor those who benefited him. Hargreave noticed Elena watching. His eyes flicked toward her, then away, his expression unreadable. Silas became aware of Langley the next morning. Langley arrived at the forge accompanied by Sheriff Pike, who looked less at ease than usual. Pike introduced him formally. "Mr. Langley is reviewing regional land claims," the sheriff said. "Routine." Langley extended a hand to Silas, his grip firm and practiced. "Crow," he said, smiling easily, "I hear you've acquired an interest in local property." Silas shook his hand once, then released it. "I've held it for years," he replied. "Only recently became relevant." Langley's smile tightened just slightly. Relevance has a way of inviting scrutiny. Silas met his gaze calmly. "I welcome it." Langley spent the day moving through town, inspecting records, asking questions, lingering where he should not have needed to. By afternoon, rumor had grown teeth. Some said Langley had found irregularities. Others claimed Hargreave was pressing for reassessment. Wade Haskins was the loudest voice in the saloon, calling it inevitable. "Men don't step out of line without paying," he said, pounding the bar. "That crow thinks he's smarter than the rest of us." Juniper growled softly when Wade passed too close to Silas that night. The confrontation came sooner than expected. As the sun lowered and shadows stretched long across the street, Langley returned to the forge with Hargreave at his side. Sheriff Pike followed, his jaw tight. Tom Rourke stood back, arms crossed, saying nothing. "Mr. Crow," Langley said, tone polite but firm, "there appears to be a discrepancy in the original survey of your land. A boundary marker may have been placed incorrectly." Silas listened without interruption. "And the implication?" "That part of your holding may overlap with land under Hargreave's claim," Langley replied. Elena arrived just in time to hear it. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "That land has been surveyed twice," she said. "The markers are verified." Langley regarded. her with mild curiosity. You seem well informed. I pay attention, Elena replied. Silas turned to Pike. You've seen the records. Pike nodded slowly. They're clean. Hargreaves smiled faintly. Clean things can still be re-examined. Silas held his ground. Then re-examined them properly. Langley studied Silas for a long moment, then inclined his head. I will, he said. Until then, the contract stands. The men departed, leaving the forge quiet but unsettled. That night, Silas walked Elena home again. The spring air was cool, stars faint behind drifting clouds. They stopped at her gate. They're trying to force you back, Elena said quietly. Silas nodded. I expected resistance. You could walk away, she said. Let it become my problem again. Silas met her gaze. It already is my problem. For the first time, Elena saw something unguarded cross his face. Not fear, but resolve, shaped by memory. I made a decision once that cost other people dearly, he said. I won't repeat it. She did not ask him to explain. The following day, Clara Bennett arrived at the forge with a small group, teachers, shopkeepers, a few laborers. We heard there might be questions about land that supports the town, Clara said evenly. We'd like to be present. It was not a confrontation. It was a statement. Langley returned that afternoon, alone this time. He reviewed the records again, slower now, more carefully. By sunset, he closed the ledger. The claim stands, he said, his tone neutral. There will be no reassessment. Hargreave did not appear again that day. Santa Fe breathed out just a little. That evening, Silas and Elena stood outside the forge, Juniper at their feet, Ash shifting calmly at the rail. This isn't over, Elena said. No, Silas agreed. But it's changed. They stood in silence, not touching, not promising. The town had decided what? It wanted to see a man stepping forward, a woman refusing silence, and the fragile beginning of something neither of them had named. Spring moved on, indifferent and patient, as Santa Fe adjusted to the consequences of daylight. Spring deepened its hold on Santa Fe not by changing the land, but by changing what people were willing to face. The air grew warmer, the nights softer, and the town, having survived another winter, turned its attention to unfinished matters. For Silas Crow, those matters arrived not as rumor or law, but as memory, carried into town by a man who knew his real name. The man came at midday, riding a bay horse with a high, nervous step. The animal was younger than Ash, perhaps 8 or 9, its coat glossy, its eyes too alert for a town like Santa Fe. The rider sat straight-backed, disciplined, as if posture itself were armor. He dismounted near the livery and scanned the street with intent precision. His name was Nathaniel Price, though most people would have called him Nate. He was 35, broad-chested, with squared shoulders and a build shaped by structured work rather than open land. His beard was trimmed close, dark with streaks of iron gray, and his hair, once blonde, had deepened into a dull wheat color, cut short and combed flat. A thin line ran from the corner of his mouth toward his cheek, the remnant of an injury that had never healed cleanly. It gave his expression a permanent sharpness, as if he were always mid-thought. Nathaniel Price had not come to Santa Fe by accident. He found Silas at the forge. Silas was shaping iron when he sensed someone watching him with familiarity rather than curiosity. He looked up and met Price's gaze. For a fraction of a second, the world narrowed to the space between them. Then Price smiled, not warmly, but knowingly. Well, Price said, his voice carrying easily over the ring of metal. I wondered how long it would take to find you. Silas set the hammer down carefully. You shouldn't be here, he said. Price's smile widened. You always did say that. Tom Rourke glanced between them, reading the tension with a craftsman's intuition. He stepped away without comment. Juniper lifted his head, ears pricked, body alert. They spoke outside, away from listening ears. I heard about the land dispute, Price said, leaning against the post with casual confidence. Sounded familiar? Man steps in, disrupts a profitable arrangement, suddenly paperwork starts misbehaving. Silas's expression remained neutral. If you're here to stir things up, you can leave. Price studied him. You still think walking away erases history, he said. It doesn't. Price had once been Silas's partner, in business, not friendship. Years ago they had worked land development together north of Albuquerque, buying claims cheap, improving access, selling at a profit. It had been clean on paper, less so in practice. When one rushed sale displaced a dozen families and left a mining crew stranded through winter, Silas had ended the partnership. Price had stayed. The success that followed had hardened him. I didn't come for forgiveness, Price said. I came with a warning. Silas waited. Hargreave has backing, Price continued, not just Langley. He's been talking to investors in Albuquerque. They know the name Crow. He paused deliberately. Your real one. Silas felt the weight of it settle. He had known this day would come. He had simply hoped it would not come here. Elena learned of Price that evening. She noticed him first because Juniper refused to settle, pacing the edge of the forge with low, uneasy sounds. When she asked Tom about the stranger, Tom shrugged. Looks like trouble that learned to dress well, he said. Elena found Silas behind the forge, tools laid out but untouched. Price stood a short distance away, his posture relaxed, eyes sharp. You must be Elena Moore, Price said, offering a polite nod. Nathaniel Price. Elena met his gaze steadily. You know my name? She said. Price smiled faintly. It's a small town. Silas spoke before Price could continue. We're finished here. Price raised his hand slightly. Of course, I've said my piece. He turned to Elena. Take care of him, he said lightly. He has a habit of carrying more than he should. When he left, silence lingered. Elena did not press immediately. She had learned that truths revealed under pressure often broke instead of bending. They walked together toward her home, spring dusk softening the street. Who was he? Elena asked finally. Silas did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was low. Someone I used to be. That night, Silas told her the rest. They sat at the small kitchen table, Margaret asleep in the next room. Silas spoke plainly, without justification. He described the partnership, the rushed decisions, the families displaced. He didn't minimize his role. I learned what efficiency looks like when it forgets people, he said. I decided never to forget again. Elena listened, her expression thoughtful, rather than judgmental. And Hargreave knows this? He suspects, Silas replied. Price confirmed it. Elena considered that. Then he'll try to use it. Yes. The next days proved her right. Rumors shifted tone. Where before Silas had been regarded with curiosity or respect, now questions crept in. Who exactly was he? Where had he come from? Wade Haskins repeated the worst versions loudly, delighted to have something sharp to throw. Men don't run unless they've got reason, he said. Clara Bennett countered quietly, correcting misinformation where she could. Sheriff Pike watched closely but said little. Price remained in town longer than necessary. He stayed at the hotel near the plaza, speaking openly with men of means, laughing easily, drinking well. He never confronted Silas again, but his presence alone unsettled the careful balance. Ash grew restless, ears twitching whenever Price's horse passed. Juniper refused to leave Silas's side. The turning point came with a letter. It arrived one morning addressed to Silas Crow, bearing a seal from Albuquerque. Inside was an inquiry, formal, precise, requesting clarification on previous land transactions associated with his name. It was not an accusation. Not yet. Silas folded the letter carefully. It's begun, he said. Elena did not panic. Then we answer it, she replied. How? Truthfully, she said. Before others decide what the truth should be. They brought the letter to Sheriff Pike and Elias Monroe. Monroe read it twice, then nodded. Transparency favors those prepared to stand still, he said. That afternoon, Silas did something he had avoided for years. He went to the courthouse and recorded an affidavit detailing his past business dealings, the dissolution of the partnership with Price, and the reasons for it. The document was factual, restrained, and complete. No defenses, no excuses. By evening, word had spread. Price confronted Silas once more, this time outside the courthouse. You're making yourself vulnerable, he said. People don't reward honesty, they exploit it. Silas met his gaze, then let them try. Price studied him, then shook his head slightly. "You haven't changed," he said. "That's the problem." "No," Silas replied. "That's the point." Price left Santa Fe the next morning. The town adjusted again, slowly. Some doubts remained, but so did respect. Elena noticed the way people looked at Silas now, not as a mystery, but as a man who had chosen accountability over convenience. That evening, as they stood outside the forge watching spring light fade, Elena spoke quietly. "You didn't have to lay yourself bare." Silas nodded. "But if I'm going to stand beside you, I won't do it half-hidden." She considered that, then reached out, not to take his hand but to rest her fingers briefly against his arm. It was a small gesture. It felt like an agreement. Spring moved forward, carrying with it the knowledge that some names, once spoken, no longer had power to wound. Spring didn't end quietly in Santa Fe. It gathered itself over days of warming air and longer light, then released its pressure all at once, the way the high desert always did, through weather that arrived without apology. The storm rolled in from the west just before dawn, darkening the sky to the color of old slate. Wind followed first, sharp and restless, bending scrubgrass low and rattling shutters. Then came the rain, sudden and heavy, drumming against roofs and turning dust into mud that clung stubbornly to boots and wagon wheels alike. Silas Crow woke before the worst of it, instinct pulling him from sleep. Juniper was already on his feet, ears back, body tense. Ash shifted uneasily at the hitching rail, snorting softly as thunder cracked somewhere beyond the ridge. Silas dressed quickly, his movements practiced, and stepped outside to read the sky. Storms like this were rare in spring, but when they came, they tested everything built without care. By mid-morning, Santa Fe was awake and unsettled. The shallow arroyo that ran west of town had begun to swell, brown water churning where days before there had been only damp sand. People gathered along its banks, voices raised over the wind. Sheriff Pike moved through the crowd with controlled urgency, directing men to keep wagons clear and animals secured. Tom Rourke had already shuttered the forge, his broad frame slick with rain as he helped brace a neighbor's loose roof beam. Elena Moore watched the water rise from the edge of the street, her coat pulled tight against the cold rain. She knew this arroyo. She had crossed it dozens of times in dry months, barely noticing its shallow curve. Now it looked unfamiliar, wide, fast, and hungry. When she turned, she saw Silas approaching through the rain, his jacket darkened, hair plastered to his temples. "The West Bank," he said without preamble. "That land of mine sits right where the water's heading." Elena followed his gaze. "If it breaks, the ridge, it'll flood straight toward the lower houses," Silas finished. There was no time for deliberation. They rode out together as the rain intensified, Ash steady beneath Silas despite the slick ground. Elena rode a borrowed mare from the livery, a bay with a narrow face and quick, nervous movements. The horse was young, perhaps 6, unaccustomed to storms, but responsive. Juniper ran alongside, his limp forgotten in the urgency of motion. The land Silas had used as collateral lay exposed beneath the storm, its gentle slope now a channel guiding water downhill. Old survey stakes protruded at odd angles, half submerged. Silas dismounted and moved quickly, assessing the ground with a practiced eye. Years ago, he had learned how water behaved when men ignored it, how it followed its own logic, punishing shortcuts with quiet cruelty. "We need a diversion," he said. "Now." Elena did not wait for instruction. She ran to a fallen fence line, yanking loose boards and dragging them through the mud. Silas worked beside her, digging a shallow trench with a shovel borrowed from a nearby shed, his hands blistering quickly but steadily. The rain soaked through their clothes, chilled them to the bone, but neither slowed. Others arrived as word spread. Tom Rourke came first, carrying a spade, his breath heavy but determined. Clara Bennett followed, skirts soaked, directing 2 older boys from the schoolhouse with sharp clarity. Sheriff Pike rode in next, rain streaking his hat brim, and without a word, dismounted to help reinforce the trench. Even Wade Haskins appeared, though his expression was tight with resentment rather than goodwill. He grabbed a shovel anyway, driven more by the sight of rising water than by loyalty. The work was brutal and immediate. Mud sucked at boots, rain blurred vision, hands slipped. But slowly the trench deepened, guiding water away from the town's edge and toward a lower, empty stretch of land beyond the ridge. When the arroyo surged again, it followed the new path, roaring but contained. By late afternoon, the storm weakened. Rain softened to drizzle, then faded entirely. The sky lifted, pale light breaking through retreating clouds. The town stood battered but intact. Silas leaned on his shovel, chest heaving. His hands were raw, his jacket torn at the sleeve. Elena stood nearby, hair plastered to her face, mud streaked along her dress. They looked at the diverted water, then at each other. "You knew this would happen," Elena said quietly. "I knew it could," Silas replied. "I should have prepared sooner." "You prepared enough," she said, gesturing toward the town behind them. "That water didn't take anything with it." Sheriff Pike approached, studying the trench with approval. "If that ridge had broken," he said, "we'd be counting losses instead of bruises." Hargreave did not come out during the storm, but he arrived the following morning, when the damage could be measured. Samuel Hargreave stood at the edge of the diverted channel, boots clean, coat immaculate. His eyes traced the altered flow, calculating. He turned to Silas. "You've improved the land," he said. "Increased its value." Silas met his gaze. "I protected the town." Hargreave's smile was thin. Intentions don't change outcomes. Before Silas could respond, another voice joined them. "Actually," said a woman stepping forward, "they do." She was new to Santa Fe, her presence immediately noticeable. Miriam Caldwell was in her early 40s, tall and composed, with dark hair streaked silver at the temples and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a practical riding coat and carried herself with the assurance of someone accustomed to authority. Miriam was an engineer with the Territorial Water Commission, dispatched after reports of unusual runoff. Years earlier, she had lost her brother to a flash flood caused by poorly planned development, an event that had shaped both her profession and her intolerance for negligence. She knelt, examined the trench, the flow, the ground composition. "This diversion is sound," she said, "improvised but effective, and it prevented downstream damage." Hargreave stiffened. "This land is under review." Miriam straightened. "Then it's fortunate someone here understands how land behaves when it's respected." Her report, filed that afternoon, was brief and decisive. The diversion was deemed a public benefit. Any reassessment of Silas's land would now require additional scrutiny, including environmental considerations that favored preservation over exploitation. By evening, the town gathered quietly at the edge of the ridge, looking out over ground that had nearly betrayed them. Children pointed at the new channel with awe. Adults spoke in low voices about what might have been. Elena stood beside Silas, the weight of the day settling into exhaustion. "You didn't just protect your land," she said. "You protected everyone." Silas shook his head slightly. "The land did the work. I just listened." She studied him, rain still clinging to her lashes. "Most men don't." That night, Santa Fe slept deeply. The storm had done what conflict could not. It had forced the truth into the open. Silas Crow was no longer a man defined by rumor or paperwork, but by action witnessed in daylight. Hargreave's influence, while not gone, had been checked by something harder to argue with than contracts. As Silas walked Elena home beneath a clearing sky, Juniper trotting ahead and Ash following at a distance, the ground beneath their feet felt different, firm, answered. "Whatever comes next," Elena said quietly, "we'll face it standing." Silas nodded. "That's the only way ground holds." Spring moved on, carrying with it the memory of rain and the knowledge that when tested, some foundations proved themselves true. Spring did not end with celebration in Santa Fe. It ended with work. In the weeks following the storm, the town settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that came after danger had passed, but memory had not. The diverted channel held firm, its banks packed with stone and timber placed deliberately by hands that had learned the cost of neglect. Men repaired fences, women scrubbed mud from floors and sorted what had been saved from what had not. Children traced the new path of water with sticks, already treating it as something permanent. Silas Crow did not stand apart from it. Each morning, he rose early and walked the ridge with Miriam Caldwell, discussing the land in plain, practical terms. Miriam moved with efficient confidence, her dark riding coat worn but well cared for, her boots scuffed from inspection rather than show. She spoke little about her past, but her work revealed it. She measured twice, planned for worst-case scenarios, and never assumed nature would forgive. Shortcuts. Together, they mapped modest reinforcements, nothing grand, nothing that invited exploitation, just enough to keep the land honest. Elena often joined them when her mother allowed it. Margaret Moore had improved since the pressure of debt lifted. Though her mind still wandered, her fear had eased, replaced by a gentler confusion. She spent more time in the small garden behind the house, touching the new shoots as if reassuring herself they were real. When Elena left her with Clara Bennett, who now visited regularly, Elena allowed herself the rare luxury of absence. Silas noticed the way Elena carried herself now, still cautious, but no longer braced for collapse. The lines of strain around her mouth had softened. She laughed more easily, though quietly, as if testing the sound. When they worked side by side, their movements fell into natural coordination, words unnecessary. The town noticed, too. Samuel Hargreave had not disappeared, but his presence had diminished. He kept to his office, conducting business through intermediaries, his influence restrained by scrutiny and the quiet authority of public opinion. Everett Langley did not return. His reassignment came without explanation, which in itself was explanation enough. One afternoon, as the sun slanted warm and low, Sheriff Pike approached Silas near the forge. Pike removed his hat, wiping his brow. "There's talk," he said. Silas looked up. "There's always talk." "This one's different," Pike replied. "About you staying, permanently." Silas considered that. "I've been staying." Pike nodded. "People are wondering what comes next." That question followed Silas into the evening. He walked with Elena beyond the ridge, Juniper trotting ahead, Ash following at a distance, content and unhurried. The land lay quiet under the fading light, green touched with gold, the air carrying the clean scent of damp soil and budding grass. "I've been thinking," Elena said, breaking the silence, "about choice, about how often it's mistaken for escape." Silas listened. "For a long time," she continued, "I thought survival meant avoiding loss. Now I think it means deciding what's worth carrying." Silas stopped walking. "And what have you decided?" Elena turned to face him fully. "That I won't trade myself for safety. But I won't refuse partnership either, just because it asks something of me." Silas felt the weight of the moment, not dramatic, not sudden, but solid. "I won't ask you to choose me," he said, "not as a solution, not as a shield." "I know," Elena replied. "That's why I'm here." They stood there, neither reaching out, the space between them charged not with uncertainty but with clarity. 2 days later, Silas called a meeting. It was not held in the saloon or the sheriff's office, but on the open ground near the diverted channel. Townspeople gathered slowly. Shopkeepers, laborers, Clara Bennett with her pupils standing close, Tom Rourke with soot still on his sleeves. Miriam Caldwell stood slightly apart, observing rather than participating. Silas spoke plainly. He explained his intention to formalize stewardship of the land, not ownership in the traditional sense, but a shared agreement that limited development and prioritized water management and safety. He spoke of modest expansion, of fair wages, of building that listened to the land rather than forcing it. He did not promise wealth, he promised stability. When he finished, silence held for a long moment. Then Tom Rourke stepped forward. "I've hammered iron for 50 years, he said. "I know when something's built to last." He nodded once. "I'm in." Others followed. Not all, but enough. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed, Elena found Silas alone at the edge of the ridge. "You've tied yourself to this place," she said. Silas nodded. "I wanted to be certain, before I asked you to do the same." She studied him, then smiled, fully, without restraint. "You didn't ask," she said. "You made room." The following week brought quiet changes. Elena moved some of her belongings from the Moore house to a small, newly repaired cabin near the forge. Nothing symbolic, nothing final, just proximity. Margaret approved without fully understanding, which was its own kind of blessing. Juniper claimed the cabin immediately, sleeping by the door as if he had always lived there. Ash grew accustomed to the new routine, grazing in a shared pasture, his steps slower now, his work lighter. One evening, after supper, Silas and Elena sat on the cabin steps watching dusk settle over Santa Fe. Fireflies flickered near the grass, brief sparks against the dark. "I used to think love was something that arrived," Elena said quietly, "like fortune or disaster." "And now?" Silas asked. "Now I think it's something you build," she replied, "and repair, and choose again when it would be easier not to." Silas reached out then, not urgently, not possessively, and took her hand. She did not hesitate. They did not speak of marriage that night. They did not need to. What they shared had already moved beyond necessity into intention. By summer's approach, Santa Fe had changed in small, lasting ways. The diverted channel held, the land remained quiet. Children learned new routes home. Adults trusted the ground beneath their feet a little more. And Silas Crow, no longer a man defined by what he had left behind, stood beside Elena Moore as someone who had learned how to stay. Not because he was needed, but because he was chosen. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they come quietly, through a man who chooses to stay, a woman who refuses to give up, or a small town that learns how to stand together after the storm. Maybe that's how God works most often. Not by removing every hardship from our path, but by placing the right people beside us when the road feels impossible. Not by stopping the rain, but by teaching us how to shape the ground so it doesn't destroy what we love. In our everyday lives, we may feel forgotten, overlooked, or tired of carrying burdens alone. But this story reminds us that no act of kindness is ever wasted, and no second chance is ever slouchy. God sees the quiet faith. God sees the hands that keep building, even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what part spoke to you most. And if you believe that love, compassion, and faith can still change lives, please subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories like this together. May God bless you and protect you. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and light to every road you walk. And may you never forget, you are not alone, and your story is still being written. Amen.